He tore it in half right in front of me. Not slowly, not symbolically, just two quick movements of his hands and my resignation letter became 4 pieces of paper scattered across the conference table. It was 8:47 in the morning. I remember because I had been watching the digital clock on the wall behind him, counting the seconds before he would look up. When he finally did, he didn't say anything for a moment. He just smiled. The kind of smile a man gives when he believes he holds every card in the room. Then he said 5 words that told me everything I needed to know about the last 18 years of my life. You're not going anywhere, Marcus. My name is Marcus Holloway. I'm 51 years old, and that morning I had walked into the executive boardroom with 1 piece of paper and one decision. 18 years of building, maintaining, and protecting the company's entire server infrastructure. 18 years of midnight calls, weekend rebuilds, and quiet fixes that nobody saw and nobody questioned. I wasn't asking for anything in that letter. I wasn't negotiating. I was leaving. And the CEO, a man named Richard Vance, had just torn that decision apart with his bare hands like it was a piece of junk mail. He leaned forward, placed his elbows on the polished walnut table, and folded his hands together. Marcus, we're rolling out the new data center migration this week. The board is watching. The investors are watching. This isn't the moment for whatever this is. He gestured at the torn paper without looking at it. We'll talk about your concerns later. Right now, I need your head in the game. Behind him, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the morning sun climbing over the city. Inside, the air felt colder than it should have. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I've spent 2 decades in rooms like that, watching men who never wrote a line of code make decisions about systems they couldn't begin to understand. Richard wasn't a technologist. He was a closer. He came from finance, then consulting, then management, and he had been parachuted into the CEO chair 4 years ago with a mandate to cut costs and inflate margins. He'd done both. And he'd done them on top of an infrastructure I had quietly held together with skill, patience, and a tolerance for sleep deprivation that no salary could justify. The CFO was sitting to his left, eyes locked on her laptop screen, pretending not to witness what was happening. The head of HR was on his right, her pen hovering above a notepad that she would never actually write on. Nobody was going to step in. Nobody was going to acknowledge what had just happened. In that company, the CEO didn't get challenged. He got accommodated. Richard kept talking. He laid out the week ahead like the meeting was a status update. We've got the East Coast migration starting Wednesday night. I want you running point. I want hourly updates during the cutover window. The Hartman account is signing the renewal on Friday, contingent on stability metrics, so we don't get to have a bad week, Marcus. He paused, looked me directly in the eyes, and added, we can revisit your situation after the quarter closes. The pieces of my resignation letter sat between us on the table. I looked down at them, then back up at him. I didn't reach for the paper. I didn't argue. I simply nodded once. Slow, measured, neutral. He took that as agreement. He moved on to the next item on his agenda like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something he wouldn't understand for another 19 hours. When I joined the company in 2007, the servers lived in a converted storage room on the 3rd floor. That's not an exaggeration. There were exposed pipes overhead, a single air conditioning unit that ran on borrowed time, and a rack of equipment that looked like it had been assembled by someone who had read half a manual and given up. The company was growing fast, signing clients faster than the infrastructure could handle, and every other week something would crash and the whole operation would grind to a halt. They hired me as a senior systems engineer. I was 33 years old, recently divorced, and looking for somewhere to pour myself into work and forget about everything else. I found it. My first month, I slept on a cot in that storage room more nights than I slept at home. There was a database corruption issue that kept resurfacing every time we processed end-of-month invoices. The previous administrator had quit 2 weeks before I started, and nobody had documentation for anything. Cables were unlabeled. Configurations existed only in someone's head, and that someone was gone. I traced the problem to a memory leak in a custom script that had been running unmonitored for 3 years. I rewrote it in a single weekend, fixed the database, and stabilized the billing system. Nobody thanked me. Nobody had to. I wasn't there for thanks. Over the next several years, I rebuilt everything. Brick by brick, server by server, line by line. I moved us off that storage room and into a proper data center on the second floor. I designed redundancy systems where there had been none. I implemented monitoring tools that could catch problems hours before they became incidents. When the cloud era arrived, I built a hybrid architecture that gave us the elasticity we needed without abandoning the on-premise systems that handled our most sensitive client data. The Hartman account, the one Richard had mentioned that morning as if it were his personal achievement, came in because of a custom security framework I had designed 3 years earlier. Hartman's CTO had looked at my architecture and told the sales team it was the most sophisticated setup he had seen at a mid-sized company. I trained engineers. I trained managers. I trained executives who later became my supervisors and then my supervisors' supervisors. I watched young men with MBAs walk into the building, spend 6 months learning the language of what I had built, and then start describing it in meetings as if they had invented it themselves. I didn't fight it. I had decided early on that I wasn't going to spend my energy fighting for credit. I was going to spend it on the work. The work would speak for itself, I told myself. Eventually, it would. It didn't. Not in the way I expected. Promotions passed me by. I watched colleagues with half my technical depth get moved into director roles while I stayed at the same senior engineer title for 11 straight years. When I finally got promoted to principal engineer, it came with a small raise and no additional authority. My direct reports had been taken away 2 reorganizations earlier, restructured under a younger manager who had never written production code. I was given a title that sounded important and a role that placed me in practice, exactly where I had always been. In the basement, fixing things, making sure the lights stayed on. My second wife, started asking questions around year 14. Quiet questions. Why was I still doing the on-call rotation when I was supposed to be principal? Why was I working weekends when the company had hired 3 new engineers that year? Why didn't I ever talk about being recognized for anything? I didn't have good answers for her. I had explanations. Excuses dressed up as patience. The truth was, I had built a system so reliable that the people running the company had forgotten it required anyone to run it. Richard Vance arrived 4 years ago. The board had been looking for someone to modernize the company, which in practice meant cutting headcount, squeezing margins, and preparing the business for a possible acquisition. He came from a private equity background. His resume was full of companies he had transformed, which was the polite word for companies he had stripped down and sold off in pieces. The board hired him with confidence. Most of them had golfed with him at some point. That was how those decisions got made at our level. For the first 6 months, he was charming. He made the rounds, introduced himself to every department, sat down with senior staff for what he called listening sessions. I had one of those sessions in the 3rd week. He asked thoughtful questions about the infrastructure. He nodded in the right places. He told me my work was the backbone of the company and that he intended to elevate the technology function under his leadership. I left that meeting cautiously optimistic. I had seen enough executives come and go to know that words were cheap, but at least the words were the right ones. Then he hired Brent Doherty. Brent came in as Chief Operating Officer, although his actual title kept shifting in the first year as Richard rearranged the org chart to suit his preferences. Brent was 38 years old, fresh out of a consulting firm, and he had never managed an operational team in his life. He had managed PowerPoint decks. He had managed client engagements. He had managed up brilliantly to partners who liked his confidence and his vocabulary. But the systems he was now responsible for, my systems, were a foreign country to him, and he had no interest in learning the language. The meetings changed quickly after Brent arrived. We used to have technical reviews where we actually talked about technical things. Capacity planning, failure modes, architectural decisions. Those reviews disappeared. They were replaced by what Brent called executive readouts, which were 45-minute slide presentations full of green status indicators and ascending bar charts. The slides told a story. The story was that everything was excellent, that operations were running smoothly, and that the team was delivering on every commitment. None of that was strictly false. It was just incomplete in the way that mattered most. I started flagging concerns in writing. I had learned years ago that verbal warnings in those meetings disappeared the moment the meeting ended. Written warnings, sent over email and copied to enough people, at least created a record. I sent dozens of those emails over the 4 years Richard was in charge. Most got the same response. A short acknowledgement from Brent. "Thanks for the heads up, Marcus. Let's keep an eye on it." That was the standard reply. Sometimes there was a slight variation. "Appreciate the visibility. We'll monitor." Nothing ever got escalated. Nothing ever got investigated. The concerns sat in inboxes and got buried under the next wave of urgent priorities. The Hartman renewal was supposed to be the crown jewel of Richard's tenure. A 5-year extension worth more than $30 million. He had been talking about it for 8 months. He had structured his entire executive bonus around it. And to land the renewal, he had committed to a data center migration that was being executed on a timeline that made no engineering sense. I had told him this directly in person in his office 4 months before that morning. I had brought him a written risk assessment. He had glanced at it and slid it back across his desk. He had told me, almost word for word, "Marcus, I appreciate the analysis, but we don't have the luxury of caution here. We need to move." I had walked out of that office knowing exactly how this was going to end. I just hadn't decided yet whether I would be there when it did. I walked out of that boardroom at 9:04 a.m. with the 4 pieces of my resignation letter still sitting on the table. Nobody picked them up. Nobody mentioned them. The meeting moved on to the migration timeline as if the previous 5 minutes hadn't happened. I rode the elevator down to my floor in silence. There were 2 other people in there with me, junior staff I didn't recognize, and they kept their eyes on their phones the entire way down. The doors opened on the 3rd floor and I walked the long corridor to my office without saying good morning to anyone. I closed the door behind me and sat down at my desk. My monitors were still on from the night before, 3 of them displaying the various dashboards I kept open at all hours. Server load, network traffic, backup status, security alerts. Everything was green. Everything looked exactly the way Richard wanted it to look in his slide decks. I stared at the screens for a long time without moving. Then I opened my email and read my own resignation letter from the sent folder. I had spent 2 hours writing it the previous evening. It was 3 paragraphs long, professional, respectful. It thanked the company for 18 years of opportunity. It gave a 4-week notice period, which was twice what my contract required. It offered to assist with the transition of my responsibilities in any way that would be helpful. He had torn it up without finishing it. I could tell from where the rip went through the paper. He hadn't read past the 2nd paragraph. I sat there and thought about what to do next. Most people in my position would have escalated, gone to HR, gone to the board, made a scene. I considered all of those options for about 30 seconds and dismissed them. I had been at this company long enough to know how those moves played out. HR worked for the CEO. The board played golf with him. Making a scene would only confirm whatever narrative Richard was already constructing about me in his head. The man who tore up a resignation letter was not a man who would respond well to public pressure. He was a man who needed to learn in a way that left no room for interpretation that he had made a serious mistake. I made a different decision, a quieter one. I decided that for the first time in 18 years, I was going to do exactly what my job description said I would do. Nothing more, nothing less. If something was scheduled, I would attend it. If something was assigned, I would complete it within the boundaries of normal working hours. If something broke after 6 p.m., it would stay broken until 8 a.m. the following morning, when the on-call engineer, who was not me, would be paid to address it. I was not going to sabotage anything. I was not going to delete files or leak information or do any of the destructive things that bitter employees sometimes do. I was simply going to stop holding up the parts of the system that I had been holding up for free, on my own time, without recognition, for the better part of 2 decades. The migration window was scheduled to begin Wednesday at 11 p.m. and run through 4 a.m. The engineering team had been planning the cutover for 3 months. I had reviewed their plan twice. I had identified 7 significant risks. I had documented all 7 in a memo that I had sent to Brent, the data center vendor, and the lead engineer on the project. None of the 7 had been adequately addressed. I had not been invited to the final go-no-go meeting that morning, which had happened immediately before my meeting with Richard. That, I now understood, had not been an oversight. It had been a decision. People who don't work in infrastructure think servers are simple. They imagine a row of black boxes humming in a cold room, blinking lights, cables in neat bundles. They picture something solid, finished, the way a building looks when you walk past it on the street. They don't see the wiring inside the walls. They don't see the foundation under the floor. They don't see the 1,000 small decisions that make the difference between a building that stands and a building that doesn't. Our infrastructure looked simple from the outside, too. From Richard's office on the executive floor, it was a line item on a budget and a green indicator on a dashboard. From Brent's slide decks, it was a pie chart showing uptime percentages and a bar graph showing transaction throughput. From the inside, where I had spent 18 years, it was something else entirely. It was a hybrid environment with on-premise servers handling our core transactional data, cloud infrastructure handling our customer-facing applications, and a custom middleware layer that I had personally designed to keep the two worlds talking to each other. That middleware was the part nobody understood. It was also the part the migration was going to touch on Wednesday night. The plan, as designed by Brent's team and approved by Richard, was to move our primary database cluster from the old data center in New Jersey to a new facility in Virginia. The new facility was cheaper. It also had a different network topology, a different storage backend, and a different power configuration. Any one of those differences could be managed. The combination of all 3, executed in a single 5-hour cutover window with no rehearsal in a staging environment, was an engineering decision that I would not have signed off on if I had been asked to sign off on anything. I had not been asked. The decision had been presented to me as final, and my job, as far as Brent was concerned, was to support the execution. I had supported it, in the only way I could without taking ownership of it. I had documented every risk. I had written runbooks for the most likely failure scenarios. I had updated the disaster recovery procedures. I had even quietly preserved a full backup of the old environment, in a configuration that would allow a rollback if things went wrong, even though the official migration plan did not include a rollback procedure. The official plan assumed success. Plans that assume success are not plans. They are wishes with timelines attached. The cutover began on Wednesday at 11 p.m. as scheduled. I was at home. I had logged off at 5:30 p.m., which was already 2 hours past my contractual end time, but I had wanted to make sure my desk was clean. I had eaten dinner with my wife. We had watched a movie, something with subtitles that she had picked out, and I had managed to focus on it for almost the entire runtime. At 11:15 p.m., my phone buzzed with the first automated notification from the monitoring system. The cutover had begun. I read the message, set the phone face down on the nightstand, and went to sleep. I slept better that night than I had slept in years. I want to be honest about that. There was no anxiety, no part of me lying awake waiting for the call. I had decided that the call, if it came, would be answered the same way any other after-hours call from work would be answered by any other employee in my position. It would not be answered at all. The on-call engineer for that night was a young man named Devin. He was 3 years out of college, talented, eager, and not remotely prepared for what was about to happen. None of that was his fault. He had been hired into the structure Richard had built. He was going to learn, the hard way, what that structure could and could not survive. My phone started vibrating at 1:43 a.m. I know the exact time because it woke me up and I checked the clock before I checked the phone. My wife stirred beside me but didn't fully wake. I picked up the phone, turned the screen brightness all the way down and read the first message. It was an automated alert from the monitoring system. Database cluster in Virginia was not responding to health checks. 2 minutes later, a second alert. The middleware layer was queuing transactions and the queue depth was growing past acceptable thresholds. 3 minutes after that, a third alert. Customer-facing applications were starting to time out. I knew what was happening. I knew because I had described this exact sequence in the risk memo I had sent 4 months earlier. The Virginia facility's storage backend used a different I/O scheduling model than the New Jersey facility. Under light load, the difference was invisible. Under the kind of load our middleware generated during peak processing windows, the difference created a backpressure problem that, once it started, would cascade through the entire stack within 20 to 40 minutes. There was a way to prevent it. There was a configuration change that needed to be applied to the middleware layer before the migration, a change I had described in the memo. The change had not been made. Brent had marked it as a low-priority enhancement that could be addressed in a future sprint. The alerts kept coming. Every 2 or 3 minutes, another system reported degradation. I lay there in the dark and watched my phone light up. I felt no satisfaction. I want to be clear about that. There was no part of me that enjoyed what was happening. These were systems I had built. Some of them I had built with my own hands late at night after everyone else had gone home because I cared about doing it right. Watching them fail was not pleasant, it was just inevitable. And inevitability, once you accept it, has a strange quality of calm to it. At 2:01 a.m. the first phone call came in. It was Devin, the on-call engineer. I let it go to voicemail. He called again 2 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail again. He left a message both times. I didn't listen to either one. At 2:14 a.m. I got my first text message from Brent. "Marcus, we have a situation, please call." I read it without reacting. I set the phone back down. I closed my eyes. By 3:00 a.m. the failure had progressed to the point where customer transactions were being lost. Not delayed, lost. The middleware had run out of queue capacity and had started dropping requests. Every dropped request was a customer order that would never be fulfilled, a payment that would never be processed, a notification that would never be delivered. The Hartman account, which had specific contractual requirements around transaction integrity, was about to register the largest service-level violation in our company's history. I knew this because I had written the SLA reporting tool that would automatically flag it to their procurement team at 6 a.m. when their morning batch processes ran. At 3:22 a.m. my phone rang again. This time it was Brent himself. I let it ring. He called 4 more times in the next 18 minutes. Between his calls, Devin called twice. Then someone I didn't recognize, probably another engineer who had been pulled in. Then Brent again. Then the head of customer success, a woman named Lara who I genuinely liked but who had no understanding of what was actually happening at the technical level. I let all of them go to voicemail. At 3:51 a.m. my phone rang one more time. The screen lit up with a name I had not expected to see at that hour. Richard Vance, the CEO. He was awake. Someone had woken him up. That told me everything I needed to know about how bad it had gotten. I let Richard's call go to voicemail too. I set the phone face down again, turned over and went back to sleep. Or at least I lay there with my eyes closed until the next alarm went off, which was my regular alarm at 6:30 a.m. By the time I sat up, the phone had accumulated 47 missed calls, 23 voicemails, and somewhere over 60 text messages. I didn't read any of them. I got out of bed, brushed my teeth, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window. My wife came downstairs in her robe. She looked at me, looked at the phone vibrating on the counter, and looked back at me. "Something happened at work," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "The migration." She knew about the migration. I had told her weeks earlier that I expected it to fail. She had asked me at the time whether I was going to try to stop it. I had told her I had already tried. She had asked what I was going to do when it failed. I had told her I didn't know yet. That morning, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, I realized I had known all along. I just hadn't been ready to say it out loud. "Are you going in?" she asked. "Eventually," I said. "Not yet." She made her own coffee. She didn't ask any more questions. After 18 years of marriage to a man who got called away at the worst possible moments, she had learned when to ask and when to wait. I appreciated her for that more than I had ever told her. I made a note to tell her later that day, when the rest of it was settled. At 7:15 a.m., I finally picked up the phone and started going through the messages. I read them in chronological order. The early ones from Devon were professional and increasingly worried. The middle ones from Brent escalated from controlled to barely controlled to outright panicked. There was a sequence around 4 a.m. where he sent the same message 6 times in 9 minutes. "Marcus, please." Then, "Marcus, I need you on this." Then, "Marcus, we cannot reach you and we need you immediately." The last message in that sequence simply read, "Please." Richard's messages started at 3:51 a.m. and continued through the night. His tone moved through several stages. It started with corporate calm. "Marcus, we have an urgent situation. Please call me as soon as possible." It moved through frustration. "Marcus, this is unacceptable. You need to respond." It eventually reached something closer to bargaining. "Marcus, I know we had a difficult conversation yesterday. Let's set that aside and focus on the company. Please call me." The last message from him had been sent at 6:42 a.m., 3 minutes before I checked my phone. It read, "Marcus, I'm asking you as a colleague, please." I read it twice. Then I set the phone down, finished my coffee, and got dressed. I put on a regular shirt and regular slacks, not the kind of outfit you wear to a meeting with the CEO. I took my time. I knotted my tie carefully in the mirror, even though I almost never wore a tie to work. That morning seemed to call for one. By the time I picked the phone back up, it was 8:10 a.m. I called Brent first, not Richard. There was a hierarchy of who deserved to hear from me, and Brent was the one who had been in the trenches all night. Richard had been making phone calls from a comfortable house somewhere. The order mattered. Brent picked up on the first ring. His voice was hoarse. He had been talking for 6 straight hours. "Marcus. Oh my God, Marcus, where have you been?" I didn't answer his question. I said, "Walk me through where things stand." He started talking, fast and disorganized, the way exhausted people talk when they're trying to summarize a catastrophe. The Virginia database was offline. The middleware was deadlocked. The rollback procedure had been attempted twice and had failed both times because the team had not preserved the original network configuration. Customer-facing applications had been down for over 4 hours. Several major clients had already filed formal incident reports. Hartman had escalated to their executive team at 5:30 a.m. and was threatening to invoke the cancellation clause in the renewal contract. The data center vendor was on a bridge call but had been unable to help because the issues were not at the infrastructure layer. They were at the application layer. They were in the middleware. They were, in other words, in the part of the system that I had built and that nobody else in the company fully understood. I let him finish. When he stopped talking, I said, "I sent you a memo 4 months ago that described exactly this scenario. Do you remember it?" There was a long silence on the other end. Then he said, "Marcus, please, we can talk about that later. Right now, I just need you to help us." "I'm not refusing to help," I said. "I'm asking you a question. Do you remember the memo?" Another silence. Then quietly, "Yes. I'm going to help you understand what's happening," I said. "I'm going to give you the steps to begin recovery. I'm going to do this from my kitchen table on the phone because I am no longer an employee of this company in any practical sense. I submitted my resignation yesterday." Richard tore it up. "I'm clarifying right now that the resignation stands. My last working day was yesterday. What I do for the next several hours, I do as a courtesy, not as an obligation. Are we clear on that?" He didn't argue. He couldn't. He said, "We're clear." I walked him through the situation step by step. The first thing I told him to do was stop trying to roll back. The rollback was making the situation worse because the configurations were incompatible. The second thing I told him to do was bring the middleware layer down completely. Not restart it. Bring it down. Let the queues drain. Let the connections close. Once the layer was fully shut down, I gave him a sequence of configuration changes to apply. They were the changes I had described in the memo 4 months earlier. They took about 30 minutes to implement correctly. While he was working through them, I drank a second cup of coffee. My wife sat across from me, reading the news on her tablet, occasionally looking up to watch me work. At 8:47 a.m., exactly 24 hours after Richard had torn up my resignation letter, the middleware came back online with the corrected configuration. Within 4 minutes, the transaction queue began to drain. Within 12 minutes, customer-facing applications started responding to requests. The recovery was not complete. There was a lot of work still to do. Lost transactions had to be reconciled. Client communications had to be drafted. The Hartman situation would require a face-to-face conversation that I would not be part of, but the bleeding had stopped. The system was alive again. Brent thanked me. He said it 3 times. Each time his voice cracked a little more. He was a man who had been at the edge of his career, and he knew it. I didn't enjoy that part. I told him I would document everything I had walked him through, send it to him in writing, and that he should not call me again. He said he understood. We hung up. I poured myself a third cup of coffee. The phone rang again before I had finished pouring. Richard. I let it ring 4 times, longer than necessary, just to feel the difference between the man who took these calls without thinking and the man who chose when to answer them. On the 5th ring, I picked up. "Marcus," he said. His voice was different than it had been the morning before. The certainty was gone. Whatever script he had rehearsed during the drive into the office had not survived the moment when he actually heard my voice. "Marcus, thank you for picking up." I didn't say anything. I let him keep talking. "I owe you an apology," he said. "What I did yesterday was unacceptable. I was under pressure with the board. I was preoccupied with the migration. None of that excuses how I treated you. I want to be clear that I value you. I value what you have built for this company. And I want to find a way to keep you with us." I let the silence hang for several seconds after he finished. I had learned over many years in many meetings that silence is one of the few tools that actually moves powerful men. They are not used to it. They fill it with concessions. Richard, I could hear, was filling it in his head. "I'm prepared to discuss compensation," he said. "A significant adjustment, a new title, a seat on the executive committee, whatever it takes, Marcus. I want to keep you here." I took a breath. I set my coffee cup down carefully on the saucer. I said, "Richard, I'm going to say something, and I'd like you to listen to it without interrupting me. Can you do that?" "Of course," he said. "Yesterday morning I walked into your office to resign," I said. "I had prepared a clear letter. I gave you a 4-week notice that exceeded my contractual obligation. I did this respectfully. I did this professionally. I did this in a way that left you with multiple paths forward, including, if you had chosen to take it, a conversation about whether there was anything that could change my decision. You did not take any of those paths. You tore up the letter in front of me. You told me I wasn't going anywhere. You went on with your meeting as if I had said nothing." He didn't interrupt, to his credit. He stayed quiet. "Last night," I continued, "the system you ignored my warnings about failed in exactly the way I described it would. I let it fail. I am not proud of that. I am not ashamed of it either. I documented every risk in writing. I provided every recommendation in writing. The decision to ignore those documents was made by you and Brent. The consequences of that decision are now yours to manage. I helped Brent stabilize the situation this morning as a courtesy. That courtesy is now exhausted." I paused. He still didn't speak. He was learning in real time what it was like to be in a conversation he did not control. "My resignation stands," I said. "My last working day was yesterday. I will provide a transition document for the middleware layer because that is the right thing to do for the engineers who will inherit the system. I will not be available for further phone calls. I will not be available for in-person meetings. I will not be available for the Hartman conversation, which is yours to have. Do you understand what I am telling you?" There was a long pause. Then he said very quietly, "I understand." "Good," I said, and I hung up. I didn't say goodbye. The word would have felt dishonest. Goodbye is for people who you expect to see again. I set the phone face down on the table and looked across at my wife. She was watching me. She had been watching me for the entire call, though she had not made a sound. She reached across the table and took my hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. After 18 years of watching me carry a weight that was never really mine to carry, she knew what it looked like when a man finally set it down. The next few weeks were quieter than I expected them to be. I had prepared myself for a fight, for legal letters, for attempts to invoke non-compete clauses that I knew, having read my contract carefully, did not actually exist in any enforceable form. None of it came. Richard, I learned later through old colleagues who reached out, had been removed by the board within 10 days. The Hartman account had not renewed. 2 other major clients had given notice. The company's quarterly earnings, when they were released 6 weeks later, had included a special charge for what was vaguely described as a service disruption event. The stock had dropped 31% in a single afternoon. Brent had been let go the day after Richard. The new interim CEO, a board member I had met once or twice at company functions, had personally called me to ask if I would consider returning as Chief Technology Officer, a position the company had never previously had. I had thanked her for the call. I had declined. I took 6 months off. I had not taken 6 consecutive weeks off in 18 years, let alone 6 months. My wife and I drove across the country. We visited her sister in Oregon. I read books I had been meaning to read for a decade. I learned to sleep through the night without checking my phone. I learned to have dinner without my mind drifting toward whatever was happening on the servers. I learned slowly, painfully, that the version of me who had built that infrastructure was a version I did not need to be anymore. He had been useful. He had done important work. But he had also missed too many birthdays. He had let too many things slip past him in his own life while he held together a system that did not value him. When I went back to work, I joined a smaller company. The title was the same kind of title I had at the end of my last job. The salary was actually a little lower, but the culture was different. The CEO knew my name. He knew what I had built before. He asked my opinion in meetings and listened to the answer. The first time I flagged a risk, in writing, his response was a 45-minute conversation in his office where we walked through the technical details together until he understood them. That had never happened to me before, not once in 18 years. I had not realized until that moment how much I had needed it. That's the part I want you to take away from this story, if you take anything away from it at all. You teach people how to treat you by what you tolerate. If you stay too long in a place that doesn't see you, eventually you stop seeing yourself. The people who built the system you depend on are not invisible. They are the system. And the day you forget that is the day the system starts running out of time. If this story spoke to you, if any part of it sounded like something you have lived through, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Tell me your version. Like the video if it resonated. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. There are a lot of Marcus Holloways out there. Some of them are still holding it all together. Some of them are about to put it down. Either way, they deserve to be heard.